Hello, biologists. Coming at you with the last example of single trait crosses that we'll go over. In the coming videos and days, we'll go over into multi-trait and two trait crosses, things like that. But for now, we're going to look at a word problem, a kind of a reasoning problem that just kind of changes the way it presents itself. But it's quite similar to what you've been doing. It just requires a really close reading and some different sort of logical thinking skills. So without further ado, let's read this out and see about how we can figure this all out. So, a lot of words here, two-part question. I'm just going to read it once, then we'll break down what you should be reading for and looking for, because that's what these questions are about. It's about reading them closely and pulling out the relevant information and being able to arrange it in a way that'll help you. Okay, so dimples is a dominant trait. We've heard that before. Dimples is a dominant trait. Bob has dimples. Bob's mom has dimples. Bob's dad does not have dimples. Bob's sister also is without dimples. So question A is asking you, what are the genotypes of Bob, Bob's mom, Bob's dad, and Bob's sister? And part B asks, Bob's girlfriend Joan does not have dimples. If Bob and Joan have children, what is the probability that their children will have dimples? All right, let's figure this out. So here's the first question that's kind of blocked off. Um, First of all, we have to set the alleles here before we can just get any genotypes going. Just going with the ones we've used for every problem, but these are up to you. Make sure they look different. So we have big D for dimples and little d for no dimples. Then I'm just going to put a little block where we can put information about each person it's asking us about as it comes up. But what we're going to do now is just read very closely. So dimples is a dominant trait. That's important to note because that'll shed light on what genotype someone has. Um, think about if someone has no dimples, that means they must be homozygous recessive. Anyways, with that in mind, let's keep reading. So dimples is a dominant trait. Cool. Bob has dimples. Okay, that's noteworthy. Bob has dimples. So what genotype would Bob be then? I feel like Dora the Explorer. You can yell back. But what genotype would Bob be? We know that Bob has at least one dominant allele. But unfortunately, we don't have enough information to say if they're heterozygous or homozygous dominant yet, because either way they would show having dimples, but we need more information about the parents and what else could be going on here. So Bob's mom has dimples, same scenario. We don't know enough about the whole case here to decide if they're heterozygous or homozygous, but we know Bob and Bob's mom both have at least one dominant allele because they both have dimples. Okay, Bob's dad does not have dimples. That is very helpful because that tells us that Bob's dad is homozygous recessive, because the only way to have the phenotype of homozygous recessive is to have two recessive alleles. So Bob's dad, little d, two recessive alleles, and no dimples. Bob's sister is also without dimples. Great, that's the exact same scenario. Now, from our first read, we have more information to figure out the genotype of Bob and Bob's mom. So the way that we're going to do this is we have to look at the parents and think about what genotypes they would have to pass on. So we know Bob's dad is a homozygous recessive, so the only type of allele they can pass on is a little d. That means one of the little d's, one of the recessive alleles the sister got is from the dad, but we know that one allele comes from each parent. So pause the video here and just looking at this like a little puzzle, try to decipher what the genotype of Bob and Bob's mom would have to be, given what we already know. You can pause it now. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we know that Bob has to be heterozygous. If you figured this out, that's awesome. The reason we know this is because Bob has dimples, so he has to have at least one dominant allele, but the dad can only pass on recessive alleles, so Bob has to receive at least one recessive allele from the father. Cool. Similarly, Bob's sister gets two recessive alleles. We know the mother has to have a dominant allele, but for Bob's sister to get two recessive alleles, Bob's mom also has to have a recessive allele. So we have that Bob and Bob's mom are heterozygotes, and Bob's dad and Bob's sister are both homozygous recessive. This is the answer to part A. So, on to part B. I'm just going to remind you before we get there, Whenever we're going to be making Punnett squares, keep these steps in mind. Feel free to pause it here and review them, but these are the same ones you should be using for all your practice. Alleles, phenotypes, gametes, Punnett square, and then answer the question asked of you. In this question, we're going to see it's not actually asking us for the genotypic and phenotypic ratios. It asks us for something different. Oh, the high budget production's still here. So here it's asking us, Bob's girlfriend Joan does not have dimples. If Bob and Joan have children, what is the probability that their children will have dimples? That's not the genotypic and phenotypic ratio. It's asking us specifically for the probability that their children will have dimples. So we'll answer accordingly, but the steps all remain the same, because by getting the phenotypic ratio, that's how we're going to figure that out anyways. So just a reminder from last page, so you don't have to keep looking back or looking at your paper. We have that Bob and Bob's mom are heterozygotes, and Bob's dad and Bob's sister are homozygotes. Here we just need to know that Bob is a heterozygote, and then we have to figure out everything else. So the alleles we already did. We said that dimples is big D, and no dimples is little d. Make sure if you're doing a part A and a part B, you keep the same allele letters for both parts, otherwise it's going to get really confusing and make no sense and be wrong. So just keep it consistent, within a question. So if we use D in part A, we're going to use D again. Okay, now we have to figure out the genotypes of each parent. So take a second, pause the video, and see if you can go on a little bit and get the genotypes and gametes of each of the parents. So Bob and Joan. This is when you can pause it. All right, so the male is Bob, and they have dimples and they're a carrier. We already know that. We figured it out on the last page. So we know that Bob's a heterozygote. Then Joan, no dimples. That means they are homozygous recessive. So Joan, the female, is no dimples and homozygous recessive. Gametes-wise, here's what's up. The heterozygote, the male Bob, can make either gamete because they have both the dominant and the recessive allele, whereas Joan only has the recessive allele, so she can only pass on the recessive allele. Oh, yeah, only pass on the recessive allele as her gamete. With that in mind, make a Punnett square and see what happens. Take a second to pause it here, and remember to put the female on top and the male on the side. 3, 2, 1. All right, so here's our Punnett square. I'm going to go through this quickly. We have our female. We've seen one a lot like this before in earlier practice. So we have our female, little d, recessive, recessive. And again, we can get rid of that because they're the same. So we can make this a really simple Punnett square, crossing the recessive allele from the mother with the two different alleles, the dominant and the recessive, from the heterozygous father. So we do that, and we end up with two possible genotypes. Take a second here and try to answer what the probability would be that their children will have dimples. Three, two, one, and children have a 50% probability of dimples, 1 out of 2 chance. This one is dimples, the heterozygote, because it has a dominant allele. This one is 2 recessive alleles, so no dimples. So you'll see this question isn't really that much harder than the straightforward ones. It just makes you think in a different way, where you have to do some reasoning and read the questions very carefully. So I just suggest for when you're practicing these, you read the questions very, very, very carefully, note down any information that's of use, like we did on the last page, and then still follow these steps when you're doing a Punnett square, because they'll keep you showing your work well and keep your thoughts going in the right order. So yeah, thank you, biologists, for going through this example with me. In the coming days, we'll have further examples on two-trait problems, and again, feel free to email me if you have any questions or requests. Have a lovely night, or day, or morning. I don't know what time it is. Have a nice day.